Hello, I'm Radical Liberation. I'm here in St. Louis, Missouri, USA, and I have with me the Mad Mercenary from somewhere in Australia.
Hello.
If you look in the description of this video, in fact, let me see myself, you should see, a link to our Discord. And that's a place where you can continue to discuss the topics that we bring up here. But there's more. Why else might they want to join the Discord, Matt Mer?
Well, on our Discord, which is a great place for having tons of great conversations about economics and business and e-currencies and gold and silver and all these sorts of great things. But we are also running a art competition. This is for a currency design competition. So we are looking for artists and people who just want to get involved with the community to come up with their best notes or coins and submit them for the competition. Though these will be discussed on a special stream at the end of the year, where we'll all just have a bit of fun, have a few drinks, and as a community come together. And the winner of this competition will be getting some silver mailed to them. And people have been asking about this, but we can now confirm this silver is funded. We have the money to buy the silver now through your super chat, so we thank you for that. And we've
even made advertising money, believe it or not.
Yes,
that's actually a component of it.
Yeah, it is. But we have enough money to do that now, so it is confirmed. It's locked in. We're going to do this, and you have till the 23rd of December, so that's just 2 days before Christmas, to get all your entries in, and then the competition entries are closed, and then just before the end of the year, we'll be running this special stream where we'll all just come together. So please come into the Discord server. We want to have you. We want to share all the information that we have. Great people in that community, people who know way more than either of us on specific topics. And yeah, just come in, be honorable, be good in your conduct, and you'll get along great with everyone in the Discord.
Let's see. So we're going to do two smaller topics before we get into our main topic. First of all, you wanted to take a look at balance sheets. Now, you chose the Australian Central Bank, which we don't tend to look at. Any particular reason?
No, I have 3 central banks, the United States, Australia, and the Eurozone.
Okay. So we'll start with Australia, which I've got ready to go, right?
Radio.
Okay, so you probably want to look at the pretty graph first, maybe?
Yeah, just change that to a line and out to the max, and then you'll have a good picture of what's going to be going on.
I'm sorry, are you telling me to do something?
Yes, so just chart, go line.
Oh, I see.
And then just hit max.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. So as we have seen, there is since the beginning of the year, there's been a massive spike in the amount of assets on the central bank's balance sheet, but this appears not to be the end of it. So a couple days ago, the Australian Treasury in the federal government, they announced just under $100 billion in stimulus packages for the Australian people. Now, please keep in mind that Australia is a population of 25.6 million people. This is a huge amount of stimulus for the size of our nation. And I worry greatly about the future, because if anybody knows that a dollar spent by government is a dollar that is inefficiently used, and a dollar that is printed, it destroys the purchasing power of the people and is a tax on your savings. It's very, very worrying, the amount of quote unquote stimulus that is going on for the size of our nation. So expect this line to get even steeper and go even higher. As it currently sits, it's $302 billion. So, if I'll just share my screen for the United States, because they're even worse.
And just 20 years ago, I note, it's 50 billion. So from 50 billion to 300 billion over 20 years, though, 100 billion of that jump was in the last year. What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? That's the point, right? Bloody hell. I'll just send you a link because apparently StreamYards doesn't like me today.
All right.
Sorry, folks. Just in the private chat.
Right. So next we are looking at the U.S. central bank.
Yep. So
and I should do the same thing, line and max.
Already done for you. Well, you will have to do the same thing. Sorry if I'm sending you the link.
Yep. And then, wait a second. Okay, stop screen sharing. Okay. I wish it was slicker to be able to have things ready and just pop them up. But anyway, sorry about the delays, guys. Go ahead.
Right. So we saw from our last update with the Fed that they were apparently going back in the right direction. You saw that little downward trend just beginning to show. Well, all of our small hopes for the Fed maybe going back to reducing their balance sheet is dashed because they have gone back to increasing it. And with the talks about the stimulus packages that should be underway to the tune between 1.6 and 2.4 trillion dollars, for if depending on who wins, the Republicans or the Democrats, that will have to go up a significant amount quite soon. So again, all of our hopes and dreams have been dashed because, well, we need more stimulus to stimulate the economy, don't we? Isn't that the right thing to do?
Yeah. So again, down at about 100 trillion just 13 years ago. And then in the last year, it's popped. I'm sorry, what did I say? 1 trillion.
100 trillion. Yeah.
1 trillion. Yeah. 1 trillion 13 years ago. Then just a year ago at 4 trillion, now up to 7 just in the last year. The central bank balance sheet. Okay, and then we have one more.
Yep. Don't believe I forgot about you Europeans, because you guys are going even worse.
Really? Okay. Okay, euro. Okay.
So these guys are at $6.5 trillion. However, there is talk that the ECB could expand the balance sheet to $10 trillion very soon. So
oh, wow.
That would mean, they would have a bigger balance sheet than the Fed. And if you understand the European structure, it would hurt the poorer nations in the European euro area harder than the more industrial nations of Germany and France. So that's something to look forward to.
Yeah, and you're saying if they do go to that 10 trillion, that would soon, and you're talking about them doing that quite soon, right?
Probably within the next over 2-year period.
Oh, over a 2-year period. Okay, because it's looking like they were under 5 trillion going into 2020. We're talking about a doubling over the course of a year or two or something.
Yeah,
depending on how quickly they move. But it's crazy stuff. And I guess what we haven't been looking into is what's happening with all this. Are the banks just holding on to this? Is it sitting there at the central banks? Is it causing
this
allocations? I don't have the answers right now on that.
This comes back to whether you believe that the money is simply staying in financial assets, or do you think it's flowing down into the real economy? I tend to believe that it's staying in financial assets and causing a financial assets bubble, overvaluing the price of these assets. But people talk about a K or a V shape recovery. I tend to think that it's going to be a K shape, although if you ask a left winger, they also say that, but they can't explain why. The K shape basically means that financial assets gain in value, but the real economy loses value. So you have two diverging lines on in regards to the economy.
Right.
I think as you'll find if you have a look at the numbers, and unfortunately we don't have time because we got to get to our main topic, you'll find that financial assets have gained in value while everyone is still suffering from lockdowns and depreciation. Not depreciation, but decreases in business. So something to look at, something to be aware of. Just keep an eye on it. Do your own investigation. Just thought everyone should be aware.
Yep, definitely. Okay. Well, nothing to show for this next topic, I guess. Right? Go ahead.
Did you have a mini?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Guys, episode previously I made a few mistakes. This was the Great Depression episode when we talked about President Harding and Prime Minister Joseph Lyons. I made a few mistakes. I need to correct them. It's the right thing to do, so I'll just state the three things I got wrong in that episode. Firstly, I say that Prime Minister Lyons entered office in 1930. This isn't true. He entered late 1931, early 1932, because the December was held in December 1931. So apologies for that. Secondly, I said that Lyons was opposed to the, quote, Premier's plan, unquote. In actuality, this was the name of his own plan in instituting austerity after the crash of 1929. This was opposed by the Labour Scullin government. In reality, he was opposed to Ted Theodore's economic plan of economic stimulus and low interest rates. Number three, I stated that per year GDP growth, real GDP growth, was 16% between 1932 and 1939. This is not true. Real GDP growth was actually between the period of 1929 and 1940. So again, apologies for getting those figures wrong. We endeavor to try and say the most accurate things on the show, and we do get it wrong sometimes because we're human, we're fallible, and we need to make corrections when we do get it wrong. So I apologize for that, and let's move on.
Okay. And I think I just figured out what to do with this pen thing, and I just did it. Okay. Little brusque in my tone there, but I just stating the facts of the matter. I just have to control the time I spend doing streams. So, okay. So, right. So the topic today is has to do with the economic history of the Middle Ages. It actually flowed out of the topic last week, where we were mostly, because we're trying to get into the economic history of Black Americans, we were mostly talking about slavery in the New World. But I noticed there was a lot of reference to slavery in the classical, in the Greco-Roman world. And so one way to think about what we're going to cover today is what happened between the two slaveries, right? Between the Greco-Roman slavery and then the slavery between that happened between Virginia and Brazil and included the Caribbean. What happened in time, two things. Because as I covered last time, slavery actually was ended in Europe, mostly, by the early medieval period. So there were hundreds of years where slavery certainly was not a factor economically. There wasn't a big slave system and factories or plantations full of slaves getting things done. But they did get things done. So I think what's going to be interesting about this is that, well, how can I put this nicely? So we don't just get lied to about, the very fine people hoax with Trump or something like that. We get lied to about all kinds of things. And I've often thought of sort of my independent study and learning and scholarship since finishing college as essentially a long attempt to correct all the mistakes that were put into my head in government school and so forth. One of those is the typical picture we have of the Dark Ages. In the tweet advertising this stream, I quoted the line from Monty Python, where they just seem to be in the dirt, throwing dirt around or something, all looking dirty and horrible. And the woman says, "Oh, there's some nice filth down here," you know. That was a funny way to put forward the picture that we have of the Middle Ages. We're getting a squeak, an animal squeak or something, Madmer, from you.
Oh, sorry, that's birds chirping in the background.
Okay. That's the picture we have. And so both in regards to science, which is not going to be our topic today, but also economic development, the picture is that there was the Growing world, which had high culture and they built awesome things and so on and so forth. And then there was just darkness and nothing and serfdom. And then for a long, long time, and then there was the, let me get the order right, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and out popped from, you know, the Europe we know, which was rich and powerful and conquering the world and so forth. The problem with that picture is that it mischaracterizes the Middle Ages quite dramatically. So let's see, I want to share one thing. I'm drawing on a book by Jean Gimpel called The Medieval Machine, The Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages. It's summarized nicely by Bionic Mosquito. If you don't know about Bionic Mosquito, I recommend him to you. He basically blogs his way through books and, you know, knows Austrian economics and is very interested in medieval history and stuff like that. This article summarizes this book, and I'm just going to really hit an early part of the book to give you the idea of the good news here. But let me start with a few comments from the beginning of Gimpel's book. Jean says, the Middle Ages was one of the great inventive eras of mankind. It should be known as the first industrial revolution in Europe. The scientists and engineers of that time were searching for alternative sources of energy to hydraulic power, wind power, and tidal energy. So there were huge advances in the Middle Ages in a number of areas, philosophy, science, and so forth, which those are really interesting topics. But given that this is the Econ chat, I'd like to focus in on economic development, the economic history of the Middle Ages. And so the main thing I want to focus on is energy, because I think for good reason, we think about, and when we think about an industrial revolution, we think about we're not doing all these things by hand anymore. We're mechanizing them. We're using some form of non-manual power, non-human power. We're leveraging that to get bigger and better and more efficient things done. That's exactly what happened in the Middle Ages, and I want to go into some depth today to demonstrate that. And when you understand that, then a lot of the other economic developments of the Middle Ages start to slot in their advances with metals and so forth. So during the Middle Ages, many of the tasks formerly done by hand were now carried out by machines. So this is part of the reason that we have the title we have today, because as I saw, just medieval manufacturing, machinery, power, mechanization, manufacturing, these are not things that we associate with the Middle Ages. In fact, it just so happens, I did not plan this. I think I'd picked the topic already that I wanted to do. And then I saw Sargon and the Britisher repeating this story of the Middle Ages. It was in response to something that was dumb. They were right to respond to it. But they made a claim about the Middle Ages, which was false, which is that, in the Middle Ages, serfs were doing everything by hand. And so, we're in a different place than they were then. That's not quite right, as we're going to find. There were machines. There was the use of power. They didn't have electric power, right? But they had other forms of power, which we'll learn about. And so this medieval industrial revolution should have resulted in some improvements in the standard of living. And it did. Jean Gimpel says there was a marked increase in the general standard of living. It's very interesting. This book was written in the 70s by a French scholar, and he has some of the modern concerns. So he goes on to say, just to give you a flavor here, the growth of industry and the search for new sources of raw materials led to extensive industrial pollution of waterways, and on a wider scale posed a severe threat to the environment with grave long-term consequences. So not only were they using mechanization to do things on an industrial scale, but it was resulting in some of the negative externalities, as we economists say, some of the negative side effects of that. So we'll focus mostly on energy, but there were also some of the things that we associate with an advancing economy. The entrepreneurs, the landowners, the financiers were able to extract large profits from this industrial expansion. And the growth of capitalism during the Middle Ages brought about modern methods of accountancy and banking, which in turn led to further expansion. And I'll be mentioning what was probably the longest running company with shareholders. And it started in the 12th century, in the 1100s. The period I'm sharing from the introduction to this book. The period was characterized by a sense of optimism, a rationalist attitude, and a firm belief in progress. I realized I should put something nice on the screen. Give me just a second. What do I need to do? Oh, yeah. Sorry for the pause here. Wasn't quite right the image I wanted. Oh, I know what I should use. Yeah, I like that. All right. Okay, there we go. That's going to be a key image very, very shortly. And I have some other things to share. Now, there is a sad part to this story, and maybe it lets us excuse a little bit of some of the bad history that we've been taught, because Gimpel says at a certain point, the dynamism of the Middle Ages began to fail and symptoms of decline became evident. Less social mobility, restrictive practices were introduced in many industries. Some of us might associate guilds with and other sort of cartel-like behavior with the Middle Ages. That's actually later, after the period we're going to focus on. That's sort of towards the end. But anyway, I don't want to focus so much on the end. I want to focus on the sort of the glorious story here. Gimpel says, if this picture of the medieval world does not sound like the Dark Ages or like the age of romance and chivalry, it is because the history of technology has been so universally neglected, thanks largely to the age-old attitude of academics and intellectuals toward manual work and engineering. And I thought this was really interesting about Da Vinci. The scorn of men of letters for engineers throughout history has kept them all too often oblivious to the technology created by those engineers who were of lower social status and worked to earn their living. They had no idea that in this other world there was an uninterrupted tradition of technological writing. Leonardo da Vinci is a case in point. As an engineer, he was despised by the literati of his time, and they, like the majority of Western intellectuals today, were ignorant of the fact that Leonardo had borrowed a great many of his inventions from technological treatises by engineers of previous generations. So Leonardo da Vinci is presented to us as the Renaissance man. Wow, this shows you that, you know, out of the darkness came this explosion of learning and invention and all that. And what Gimpel is saying, if you really understand the history of innovation throughout the Middle Ages, you realize that Da Vinci was just building on a lot of progress that had come before him, and a lot of engineering work that had come before him. I wanted to read that passage about the literati versus the history here, because I run into this theme again and again, even with certain individuals who stream on YouTube, who I won't name, which is that because they're absorbing a lot of the products of the literati, you know, literature and so forth, they don't pick up on certain things. They tend to struggle with economics, and they don't have a good sense of economic history or the history of engineering and things like that. And so they can be blind to some of these developments. And also, and I don't think I'd said it yet, but it's worth saying that in my view, part of the reason that the Enlightenment in particular leaves us with a certain picture of the Middle Ages is because they were anti-Christian. You could say anti-Catholic, but I think it's fairer to just say that they were anti-Christian overall. And the Middle Ages was Christendom. You know, it was called that for good reason. And so if you don't want Christianity to look good, you don't want the Middle Ages to look good. So I think that's part of one of the biases here. So, okay, so focusing on energy then. The Middle Ages introduced machinery into Europe on a scale no civilization had previously known. Now, again, this is one of these things you might have heard of, you know, a certain machine that the Greeks made or something. In a lot of the cases we're going to see here, it's not that it was completely unknown in China or in ancient Greece or whatever. Some of these things we'll be talking about. But there's a huge difference. In a way, this is why the focus of the show is so nice. There's a huge difference between, oh, look, they invented that. Well, yeah, just because someone invented it doesn't mean it's like helping economically, right? Just because, you know, the emperor of China has a water clock or whatever, that doesn't mean that it's having an impact in the wider society, in the way the economy is functioning, in the way that people cooperate and so forth. So a theme we'll see again and again is that if the Middle Ages didn't invent the thing, which in many cases it did, if it was something that was around before, the Middle Ages expanded the use of it in a dramatic way. So machines were known in the classical world, but their use in industry was extremely limited. Cogs and gears were employed only for creating toys or automata. In medieval society, however, machinery was made to do what previously had been done only by manual and often hard labor. And as I quoted in the promo for this show, medieval man was surrounded by machines. Okay, so what was the big machine? The big machine was the mill, primarily the water mill, and that's why I've got the image I've got there. Which, by the way, if I'm remembering correctly, this is, if you just look up water mill on Wikipedia, you'll see this image. This is a 12th century water mill, or it dates back to the 12th century, I should say. And as you can see, it's driving a, sorry, I don't know my mechanics very well. It's driving, that's the shaft, sorry. It's the water, the flow of the water is driving the shaft, and then they attach to the shaft and make use of that mechanical power in various ways. Most common was using water or wind to grind corn, crush olives, full cloth, I'll explain more about that later, tan leather, make paper, and so on. And these were the factories of the Middle Ages. So this is why Gimpel feels it's justified to talk about an industrial revolution in the Middle Ages, because though water mills, for example, were known, and the Romans had a few, they were not used in a wide scale, and they didn't really change the game in terms of the system. Much of the manpower, much of the power was still provided by slaves under Rome. But in the Middle Ages, as slavery declined and declined, as you get up to the year, like say 1000, when slavery is just not, it's not a significant economic factor. I'm not saying there were zero slaves, but there's not a slave system that's keeping everything going. As that declines, they're really turning to wind power and water power and so forth, and using it on a huge scale, which we'll see soon. So in the towns and villages, the citizen could stand on a bridge over a river or canal and observe the different types of water mill. Mills built along the banks, others floating midstream or moored to the banks. And under the bridge, you'd find the same machines built between the arches of the bridge, which worked very nicely because the water would rush more through the arch, so you'd get more power out of it. If you walked upstream, you'd find that the river was dammed to provide a sufficient fall of water to drive the machinery. Building rather significant dams became a huge, became some of the big building projects of the Middle Ages, designing and building dams. And so the way to think about this is that oil in the 20th century plays a similar role as water power did in the Middle Ages. They used it for all kinds of things. So let's see here. So what did they do with the water? Well, they, for one thing, they could channel water using this system. They use the water power, but they would also channel the running water for domestic purposes as well as for industrial ones. So they would carry it in lead or wooden pipes to the kitchen for cooking, washing, to the gardens for watering. Water was used to clean out the drains, carry away the waste so as to leave everything spotless. So here's a passage from the Clairvaux report talking about an abbey, I think. A lot of these were monasteries that were doing these things. Entering the abbey under the boundary wall, which like a janitor allows it to pass, the stream first hurls itself impetuously at the mill, where in a welter of movement it strains itself, first to crush the wheat beneath the weight of the millstones, then to shake the fine sieve which separates flour from bran. Already it has reached the next building. It replenishes the vats and surrenders itself to the flames which heat it up to prepare beer for the monks. Their liquor, when the vines reward the wine-grower's toil with a barren crop. The stream does not yet consider itself discharged. The fullers, established near the mill, beckon to it. In the mill, it had been occupied in preparing food for the brethren. It is therefore only right that it should now look to their clothing. The water never shrinks back or refuses to do anything that is asked for. One by one, it lifts and drops the heavy pestles, the fullers' great wooden hammers, and spares thus the monks' great fatigues. How many horses would be worn out? How many men would have weary arms if this graceful river, to whom we owe our clothes and food, did not labor for us? I love that passage because it covers a lot of things. What it doesn't mention is the use for working with metal. They would use water power to do the bellows, to get the fire hot so that they could get up to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, I think it is. I hope I'm getting it right, that it's Fahrenheit. 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and be able to melt the iron ore and work with metal. And then also the, you always picture the blacksmith hammering the metal. They automated that, also using water power, so that they're automated, sorry, losing my words. When you hit something on a anvil, yeah, so like an automated anvil, right? An automated hammer and anvil setup. Medieval society gave itself wholeheartedly to mechanization, while the classical world adopted it to only a limited extent. And part of the picture, to be fair here, is that we had a different situation between the Mediterranean and the British Isles and the continent, the above the Mediterranean, which is where you find so many of these water mills. If the flow of water was only seasonal, then that reduced the usefulness of the water mill. So you wanted a year-round flow of water, and that was less likely in the Mediterranean, I gather. The Romans did sometimes overcome this by building aqueducts to bring water to the mills, but that was a costly undertaking, and it didn't, they didn't do it on a large scale. They mostly used slaves. Okay, let's see. Oh, now this is interesting. This is where economic policy comes into it. So the Romans resisted mechanization at a policy level. They were concerned about the effect it would have on the employment level of free labor and slaves. The Emperor Vespasian, so this is 69 to 79 AD, turned down a labor-saving device on these grounds. He said to a mechanical engineer, or writing about Vespasian, to a mechanical engineer who promised to transport some heavy columns to the capital at small expense, he gave no mean reward for his invention, but refused to use it, saying, "You must let me feed my poor commons." And by commons, he means the free labor in that particular case. So there was a little bit of a Ludditism happening, right? Yeah, Martian pundit said it, Roman Luddites. Right, but then slavery declined in importance. And then the use of water mills just went through the roof. So let's see, on the banks of the Robec, which joins the River Seine at Rouen, there were 2 mills in the 10th century, 4 in the 11th, 10 in the 13th, and 12 at the beginning of the 14th. In the department of l'Aube, also in France, 14 water mills are mentioned in the 11th, 60 in the 12th, and over 200 in the 13th. So this isn't, I'm going through this carefully. I want to make sure that you don't get the picture that this is just another novelty. Oh, they made a couple more water mills. Water mills were ubiquitous in medieval Europe. They were doing this all over the place. In particular, we have some Brits among us. There's this thing called the Domesday Book. I've already forgotten the year. It's 1069, 1089. Anyway, late 11th century, the Domesday Book does an accounting of a number of things. Well, the mills were of particular interest because they wanted to tax them, right? And this was, the Domesday Book was basically for figuring out where everything is so it can be taxed. So they found, the Domesday Book recorded 5,624 water mills in England. Yeah, thank you, Domesday Book 1086. Of the 9,250 manors, more than 1/3 had 1 mill or more. So 3,400 of the manors had water mills. And he mentions, Gimpel mentions, only about 2% of the mills have not been located. That is, we don't even have to trust the Domesday Book. It had a map. It showed where they were. You go back. They went back at some point, I guess, and could see, the evidence that it was there, that it was still there in many cases. So on a nationwide basis in England, each of the 11th century water mills would have supplied an average of 50 households. So, mentioning that just to adjust for population, right? What was it? The 35,600 water mills may not sound like much, but there weren't as many people back then, right? So one water mill supplying the needs for 50 households, when you consider that the water mill was automating the making of clothes and so on and so forth, people were getting real benefit right in their home. Go ahead.
We should also mention the fact that many more people used to live in a single household back then. So you would have multiple generations living in a single household. So that should also be kept into account.
Right. And I wish I could show you a good image. The image in the copy of the book I have is not exciting, but I'll trust the author. He says, a map of England's river system with the 5,624 Domesday water mills is an amazing sight. It is literally covered with dots, especially the areas to the south of the Severn and the Trent. On rivers like the, wish I had Matt Merck to teach me how to pronounce these things, where is it AA is from and the rest of them? Wales. I think I need a Welshman or something. On rivers like the Wylye, W-Y-L-Y-E, the Wylye, in Wiltshire, the concentration of mills is remarkable. 30 mills along some 10 miles of water, 3 mills every mile. So that's the picture I want to try to get into your heads, that this is when we talk about an industrial revolution in the Middle Ages, it's no joke. The classical world, the Greco-Roman world, just did not use non-manpower on the level that we see here. This is, it's really a whole new world happening in the Middle Ages relative to the classical world. Okay, so now, go ahead.
We should probably talk about why we saw over this period, not just the invention of new technologies, but the implementation on a mass scale of these technologies. Right. To do that, we have to do a tiny bit of history. Obviously, during the late Roman era, this late classical era, things were going to hell in a handbasket. The Western Roman Empire especially, was collapsing. Rome had been burnt to the ground several times by this point. It's all going to hell, and obviously under those conditions, no one's really looking after the money, and many emperors before had devalued the currency to pay for their wars and funding the army and trying to keep in power. So the financial situation of the late classical era was incredibly horrid. And so what we find is that as the Western Roman Empire especially dissolved and new states came in and they were able to stabilize the situation and stabilize the currency especially, you found that currency accessibility went up and the value of this currency went up. And what happened is that people were able to invest in new machinery, invest in these automated processes much easier than what they would have been able to do in this late classical era. So this is why you see the expansion of many of these technologies that just didn't happen beforehand. It came down to basically stability and access to capital. As Rothbard would put it, you can come up with an idea, but it's really the access to capital that's the linchpin in its implementation. You're just muted, Radlip.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, come on. Yeah, I've shared it before, but on that last point about the overemphasis on invention and the underemphasis on, the application of capital to take an invention and take it from an idea to something that people can really do something with. I did write an article on that. I think I've shared it before, but yeah, I think that version of the article is okay. Anyway, but I use the mouse, the computer mouse, to illustrate this point. And it just can't be emphasized enough. Again, going back to that theme about the literati, right? They want to write a book about inventors, right? And for whatever reason, they find it less interesting to talk about what it takes to take a cool idea and make it actually be something usable to real people. I'm an engineer myself, so I find that interesting. But but it doesn't tend to be written about as much. The engineers don't get things named after them and so forth as a general thing. Okay, so these mills were valuable. They, people, would bring, say, their corn to be milled or whatever, right? Their cloth to be fulled, which again, I'll explain that shortly. And they would pay for the privilege of using the power of the watermill. So the watermill began to become something around which financial things happened, right? Let's see, in France, the citizens of Toulouse set up a company, that of the, I'm going to butcher this, Basicle, where the shares of the mills on the Garonne were subject to annual fluctuations in value. The mill shares were bought and sold freely like shares on a contemporary stock exchange. The Société du Basicle may well be the oldest capitalistic company in the world. It survived, I believe it started in the 1100s or 1200s, I forget which. It survived into the middle of the 20th century when it was finally nationalized by the Électricité de France, because by then this mill had been turned into producing electricity. Over the years, they had continued to modernize and use it. So I think it's still functioning to this day. So 800 years this mill was there. But to our point here about economic development, you had shares. You had people who invested in this. So it wasn't the one running the mill who was necessarily providing the capital. That was started to get separated, which is what we, Mises said, this is the key thing. Rothbard said, how did we tell, we don't have pure capitalism anywhere, right? So when do you say, yeah, this is a capitalist economy? And Mises answered very simply, if there's a stock exchange. That is, at that point, we've separated those functions of finance from, management of the company, working at the company. We're starting to have all that division of labor. And at that point, you've got essentially capitalism. So we had capitalism in the Middle Ages in a way very recognizable to us, including eventually the use of the term, what would be translated from French. In French, it's action, like action, but it's translated properly in English as share. And the action holder, I'm not remembering the French, the shareholder. This was all happening 1,000 years ago. Okay, now, let's see here. Yeah, so just a little bit of engineering advancement here. The mill mechanisms were substantially different for doing metal work, I think. You had to forge iron. They were different from the corn mills. Instead of a rotary movement to drive the millstones around and around, right? You'd have a big millstone, you just need it to be turning, right? A reciprocal motion was needed to reproduce mechanically the action of the smith, right? So you want the hammer, you're automating the hammer. So that's a different kind of motion. So how did they do that? This was done by cams projecting from the axle of a water wheel, which raised and then released the pivoting trip or tilt hammer. The engineers of the classical world, men like Hero of Alexandria, knew the use that could be made of the cam, but applied it only to animate toys or gadgets. But in the Middle Ages, they took the cam and they started getting real work done with it. In Europe, from the end of the 10th century, so we're talking the 900s, the cam enabled millwrights to mechanize a whole series of industries, which up to then had been operated by hand or by foot. In France, one of the first mills for making beer is mentioned in a document in the 980s, 990s. Water-driven hammers were operating as early as 1010 in Germany. Hemp seems to have been treated mechanically in 1040. So we're really talking the Middle Ages. So I'm not cheating and telling you about stuff. I saw interesting information from like the 1500s and 1600s and stuff like that. I've left it all out. I really wanted to convince you what we think of as that time period of the Middle Ages, 800s, 900s, 1000, 1100. This stuff was happening back then. Now, paper is really interesting. So like I said, it wasn't all about inventing things. It was what Christendom or medieval Europe did with it. Paper had been around 1,000 years in China, right? But it had been manufactured by hand and foot all that time, right? Well, paper comes to Europe in about the 13th century, and they instantly, historically speaking, instantly they're manufacturing it mechanically. So the paper mill traces back to the 1200s and had never existed before medieval Europe got a hold of paper and decided, we want to make a lot of this stuff. So the Europeans were technologically minded. They're like, we can do this better. Hey, Tragic Vision says Kirkcudbright has a fair few mills. As far as I can tell, my last name, Carson, traces to Kirkcudbright. I don't know if Tragic Vision mentioned that because he knew that, but as far as I can tell, that's the land of my father's, Kirkcudbright, the Kirkcudbright area. So that's kind of cool. Right, go ahead.
Can I jump in here? Yes.
Yep.
So this really points back, because obviously to operate a mill, you need, a water supply. You need water. Pretty obvious, but I think some people overlook that. So certain areas that have rivers or canals or can build canals, this makes them more valuable. This makes them more prime real estate, shall we say, even more than what they were in the past, because in the past, obviously, civilizations and cities, as we know, popped up around rivers because it's easier for transport, it's easier for waste disposal, it's easier for water supply, all of these good things about rivers, and then it just becomes even better. So areas that have rivers become even more valuable real estate. Now, as we can tell from a map of Europe, there are a lot of rivers. And there's not just a lot of rivers, but a lot of rivers that can be used for this purpose, used for transportation, used for water mills. And this is what gives Europe an advantage over other areas in the world. Not to say that the water mills, the reasons that the Europeans are diverge so far ahead of many other regions on the earth, but these sorts of natural advantages that the European area had can be seen in the watermill and the use of the watermill. Just to throw that in there, because we're trying to focus also on the economics here. This sort of geographic element is very big in determining sometimes the wealth of these areas, especially if free trade is not a concept.
Yep.
Then we should probably, after you go through the technology, go list off a couple more and then get on to what ruined this development, because that's also something we should touch on.
I wasn't going to try to cover that. I just wanted to tell the happy story. Okay, fulling. So I want to talk about fulling cloth, which is one of the things that they automated with the water wheel. Because, let me jump to the punchline first, then I'll go into the details. The introduction of the fulling mill has been described as an industrial revolution of the 13th century. So that's the 1200s. A revolution which brought poverty and discontent to certain old centers of the industry, but wealth, opportunity, and prosperity to the country as a whole, and was destined to alter the face of medieval England. The mechanization of fulling was as decisive an event as the mechanization of spinning and weaving in the 18th century. If you've done any learning about the Industrial Revolution, they talk about pottery and about the mechanization of making clothing. Well, the mechanization of fulling dealt with a certain aspect of making clothing, and that is that after leaving the loom, cloth had to be scoured, cleansed, and thickened by beating it in water. Originally, this was done by men trampling the cloth in a trough. Eventually, the feet of the men were replaced by two wooden hammers, which were alternately raised and dropped on the cloth on the tilt hammer system by means of a revolving drum attached to the spindle of a water wheel. A whole series of hammers could replace a large group of fullers and could be operated with only one overseer. So this was big business, and he goes into some amusing stories about abbots fighting with people and almost just about little local civil wars over who controls the mill and trying to make people use the mill and all this sort of stuff. But anyway, it was a big deal, is my point. It was a big economic deal. Let's see. Talked about that. Yeah. Okay. So they didn't want to. Eventually, they didn't want to leave it to chance and the seasonal fluctuation of water. They wanted to have a nice, consistent water flow throughout the year for the mill to always be running. Right. I mean, that's what you hear about factories. They want that factory to be working every day. They don't want it to be down for a day. Right. Well, same thing here in this early and Middle Ages Industrial Revolution. And so they built dams. And they would have, dams at different points in the river and then argue with each other, hey, you built your dam too high down there, so I'm not getting the drop that I was getting from my dam down to the water level below. I'm not getting the drop I was getting before, because it's that drop they would use, right, to really produce a lot of power water mills. The building of the dams was a remarkable feat of the intense amount of water flow. And I would love to see I should look up some videos of how they do this kind of stuff. Like, you're actually building down into the earth while water's flowing the whole time. You can't just turn the water off, build the dam, and then turn it back on. I don't understand it. So there were dam engineers. The Bazikli Dam was first mentioned in a document of 1177. So, the engineering at the time was quite good. And in economically significant ways, I think we look back at the classical buildings and we marvel at aesthetics, right? But of course, there's the Gothic cathedrals and stuff. But anyway, never mind that. Forget aesthetics for a moment, and let's just talk about practicalities. The practical engineering skill in the Middle Ages by this time had so far surpassed the classical world. Kind of knew in theory that you could do certain things. Well, the Europeans of the Middle Ages were doing those things on this massive scale. And to illustrate how much, well, I mentioned that there would be lawsuits between the owners of the dams over the water levels. Let's see. Yeah, and then I think we already covered this division between capital and labor. The millers were employees who had no say in the company's decisions. The shareholders in the case of the Bazikli were wealthy Toulouse citizens who had no special knowledge of or interest in milling except to receive a profit from it. So that division of labor, division of capital, and management and so forth. The price of the shares would fluctuate like any contemporary shares quoted on the stock exchange. It varied according to the economic situation, the good or bad working order of the mills. Shares rose to a very high level in the years following 1350 after the Black Death. They fell when the dam or the mill was battered by a flood. As in modern times, the price of shares anticipated results. And on average, the shares brought in a return of 10 to 25% a year, which is really good. I would like to have some of those shares. So that there was a great interest in owning part of these mills. And then eventually the shareholders in these various dams decided to pool their profits and losses, and they formed an association and essentially what we would now call a limited company. There were annual general meetings of the shareholders where the accounts of the previous year were rendered and where managers were elected who would act for the shareholders until the following year. I'm sorry, I'm going into all this detail because I just want you to hear how familiar sounding this all should be. This isn't made up. They really did have an industrial revolution. They really were having a functioning capitalist economy in the middle of the so-called Dark Ages. Oh, one other thing I want to mention, which was not known in classical times, and I think is just amazing, is a tidal mill. Okay, so they're literally using the power of the tide, and I'll explain how in just a moment. Um, there was an urge to discover new sources of energy during the Middle Ages, and this is one of the ones they figured out, and there were quite a few of them. 3 tidal mills in Devon and Cornwall in the 13th century. By the 19th, there were 25 of them. So starting in the 1200s, they started to build these tidal mills, and they added more every century. So what's a tidal mill? It's built in a low-lying area along shallow tidal creeks, often quite a distance inland. Dams would be built to create ponds as large as 13 acres. And then swinging gates were built in the dam to allow the tide to flow into the ponds. So you open the gate, the tide comes in, the pond fills up. Okay. Then when the tide turns, the pressure of the water, now greater inside, would automatically close the gate. The miller would wait until the level of water below the mill had dropped sufficiently as the tide goes out, right? Now you've trapped all this water in this pond. And then he would let the dammed water escape, but through the mill race to drive the water wheels. So let it come in the gate, and then it come out and hit the water wheels. And then, of course, as you know, if you've seen the classic tourist photos of Holland or whatever, right, there was wind power. I focused on water power because I gather that that was more significant source of power during the Middle Ages. But they did figure out about harnessing wind power in the 12th century. And let me show you a post mill. Okay. Oh, and just before I show you this, let me tell you how well known this technology was. At the time of the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, post mills were exported to the Middle East, where they were never known. So it says, the German soldiers used their skill to build the very first windmill that Syria had ever known, an eyewitness says. So the Industrial Revolution of medieval Europe, by the late 1100s, was sufficiently established to start exporting its innovations, right? So let me show you something about, let me show you a bit about the post mill, because I've seen these pictures, the pretty Holland windmills. I never really understood like how they worked, and it's kind of amazing. You're getting some of my engineering side here. Okay. Oh, great. I have to see. Yeah, okay. I want the 1121 first. All right. Okay, so here's a diagram. And so the problem with the wind, unlike the water where the river flows, you know, there's upstream, downstream, and that's pretty much how the river works. The wind blows in different directions, right? So if you build a standing windmill, and I think that's all that was known in classical times. If you make a standing fixed windmill, then you'll only get something out of it some of the time. So what you'd really like is you'd like to be able to turn your blades in the direction of whichever way the wind is blowing at the time. So look at this amazing design. The whole mill, including the part that, you know, where you actually do the work with the power, right? You know, the grinding of corn or whatever's going on inside there. The whole thing is put on something that can rotate. And then you can turn in this design, this is just a diagram, but you can turn the whole house to face wherever the wind is, right? So let me show you. It's a modern version, but switch to a picture that shows you what these look like in real life. I think that's the one I want. Yep. Okay, so there we see, and if you look carefully, you see these two circles. The outer circle is just the fence, I guess, so somebody doesn't drive in and get hit by this thing going around. The inner circle is where that wheel is going as the whole thing rotates. And you can see that the whole mill is sitting on top of something that presumably has some kind of wheel in it or whatever, some way of rotating. But that's not all, because look at this. And I'm not totally clear if this is from the Middle Ages, but it's awesome. So I'm just going to share it. I bet you they figured this out, though. So here, Now, as I understand this design, you don't even have to turn the mill anymore. And I don't know if it was so heavy they had to, have horses on standby to turn the thing as the wind turned. In this case, it looks to me like that spinning thing on top of the stairs is going to spin if the wind is hitting it. And if the wind is hitting the main blades of the mill, this thing's going to be behind the wind and it's not going to do anything. So as long as it's getting some wind, it's going to rotate this thing until it's not getting wind, and therefore the front blades are getting wind. I mean, that's pretty awesome engineering, I think. Anyway, so that's called the post mill. Okay, so that's some of the main technology. I just wanted to share a passage from Chaucer and then mention very lightly, I decided to just focus on energy because I think we all understand once you have energy, a lot of things flow from there, right? In this case, water power, wind power, and they're capturing it very well. One more form of energy I'm going to explain in just a moment. But before we leave mills, this is a passage from Chaucer. So the burden of the high rentals demanded by the water, wind, and tidal mill owners often encouraged the millers to exceed the legal levy of meal or flour, which was normally 1/16 of the grain ground. That is, there was a price control. You could only take a certain amount of meal in payment. The miller could only take a certain amount of it in payment. But sometimes they would take more, right? To pay the rent on the mill. And so Chaucer in the Reeve's Tale tells a little story about this. At Trumpington, not far from Cambridge town, a bridge goes over where the brook runs down. And by that brook, there stands a mill as well. There was a miller lived there many a day, as proud as any peacock and as gay. This miller levied toll beyond a doubt on wheat and malt from all the land about, particularly from a large-sized college in Cambridge, Solar Hall. 'Twas common knowledge. They sent their wheat and malt to him to grind it. Happened one day the man who ought to mind it. The college manciple lay sick in bed, and some reported him as good as dead. On hearing which, the miller robbed him more, 100 times than he had robbed before. For up till then, he'd only robbed politely, but now he stole outrageously, forthrightly. The warden scolded hard and made a scene, but there, the miller didn't give a bean, blustered it out and swore it wasn't so. Anyway, so great fun. Okay, so just one other aspect of energy was the impact on agriculture. Obviously, we know that with the Industrial Revolution, improvements in agriculture had a lot to do with the freeing up of labor to not be living hand to mouth anymore and be able to do something else, like work in a factory that makes clothing or something like that. So all of these things we're talking about had an impact on agriculture, but also more directly, there's the issue of the horse. And some people may know that there were innovations in the use of the horse during the Middle Ages. I won't go into great detail, but basically a medieval horse could carry a wagon that weighed 2,500 kilos, loaded with 2,500 kilos of stone, so 5,000 kilos. The maximum load a pair of horses was authorized to pull on roads in Roman times was 500 kilograms. So from 500 to 5,000. And so Roman horsepower was so useless that it could do so little that Romans never used them in agriculture. So this guy, Lefebvre de Noailles, in 1910, he actually did a series of experiments in Paris to verify his theories about ancient horsepower versus medieval horsepower. He recreated the harnesses from the ancient world that you could see in the monuments and stuff. And he found that they had difficulty, indeed, with the ancient harnesses in pulling a load in excess of 500 kilograms, which fits that regulation that the Romans had. You can't go over 500 kilos on a road. But then in Middle Ages Europe, either from borrowing from other places or coming up with them themselves. They made a number of innovations. One is that they improved the collar. So they used a rigid collar that went up against the shoulder bones. The ones in the Greek and the Roman, you'll see these horses like with their heads up. That's because they're being strangled with the way that they were harnessing the horses back then. In the Middle Ages, they found how to put it on their shoulder, put the weight on their shoulders, and then they could carry a lot more. Furthermore, horseshoes, iron horseshoes, were an innovation of the Middle Ages. And that also improved the ability of the horse to do work. Let's see, it says, by the 12th century, horseshoes were mass produced, and the great iron producing center of the Forest of Dean in southwest England carried out an order for 50,000 horseshoes for Richard I's crusade, to give you an idea of the scale of what was going on here. And then there was one more technique unknown to the Romans that was discovered by the Middle Ages, on top of the harness, on top of the horseshoes. And that was hitching horses one behind the other. And that distributes the weight to be pulled equally among as many as 4 horses. So you could use more horses at once and carry a greater load. And the Romans never figured that out. Anyway, so the horse became more productive than the ox, which is what had traditionally been used for agriculture, and they saw great improvements. Okay, anyway, so that's that.
We should also mention there.
Yeah.
We should also mention that there was a significant improvement in the types of horses that were breeding. So, as anyone knows, with animals, people breed animals to have the best traits, and we develop animals through different sorts of breeding and genetic manipulation. And the horses of the Middle Ages was far superior to the horses of the classical era. And again, this is just development. The horses of the classical era were significantly smaller and weaker in comparison to the horses of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I didn't want to get off onto war, but I was reading a passage talking about how basically if you took a knight using the the horseshoes, the saddle, the iron, basically you take a medieval knight and put him up against Roman soldiers, he'd be like a tank. He would just plow them under. So they weren't so primitive. So just to nod very briefly at one other thing, iron, I mentioned, use of iron was increased greatly, whereas bronze was the more heavily used metal during Roman times. Every medieval village had its ironsmith. It was common practice for every horse and plow animal to be shod, as I mentioned. And then one last thing to mention is the clock. I hinted at this earlier, whereas in China, the art of the clock was kept as an imperial secret with only a handful of scientists and engineers privy to the details. In Europe, the technology spread relatively quickly. As one might expect, I like this shot this is from the Bionic Mosquito article I shared. As one might expect without the state intervening in the enforcement of intellectual property. I agree with him on that. So by the 14th century, the weight-driven mechanical clock was quite common in Europe, and the technology spread quite rapidly. So just wanted to mention that. As you may know, the clock isn't just, it's interesting for various reasons, but it actually has implications for being more productive. Things like coordinating, right? I'll arrive with the shipment at 1 o'clock, be there to pick it up, right? If you have clocks, reliable clocks, all this sort of thing becomes more doable, and so the clock actually has economic significance. Let's see, Lewis Mumford said, the clock, not the steam engine, is the key machine of the modern industrial age. In its relationship to determinable quantities of energy, to standardization, to automatic action, and finally to its own special product, which just having a clock in your house. The clock has been the foremost machine in modern techniques. And so the clock also is from the Middle Ages. So I hope I've painted a good picture here.
We have a couple other things that we can mention. So, for example, eyeglasses.
Yes.
We also have eyeglasses, very significant improvement, because people not only glass technology to manipulate glass so that people could see better, which is if you just think about that, that's amazing for the time period that we're talking about. But also we had, and oh, by the way, these eyeglasses, I don't know whether we can get a picture up. These eyeglasses were adjustable. They were adjustable to your face, to the bridge of your nose. So these were not just some very crude eyeglasses. For what they were at the time, they were very, very sophisticated. We also have fire blast furnaces, increasing the heat that could be used. So you can manipulate more metals. You can develop in metallurgy. This is these are significant improvements in industry and the ability for people to use their specialized skills. And this is what we're really talking about here. Is this, we're increasing in specialization and mechanization in order to help do that. But in order to do that, you need to have these technologies and these things available to the wider world. As you were saying, in China, in the Middle East, in Africa, in some areas of the Americas, especially South America, many of these technologies were invented, but they were locked up. They were kept secret. People were worried that they would get out. Whereas
Or
in
even
Europe,
forbidden. Sometimes they'd be forbidden by law.
Yeah, exactly, forbidden. But whereas in Europe, because of this competition, because of this freedom, which is very rare, unique to Europe in many ways, they were able to take these technologies, develop them, implement them on a wide scale, and come up with modern ideas and really accelerate into their dominance, really. And this comes from having many factors. This comes from having the right geography. This obviously comes from having the right culture and innovative spirit, and looking at something and saying, "Hey, we can improve that." It doesn't matter where it came from. We can improve on that. We can use that, and that sort of innovative spirit and willingness to experiment and freedom and is something that should be really emulated in our culture. And it all started really in the Middle Ages and in the late classical era.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this up, because right at the beginning of Bionic Mosquito's article summarizing this book by Jean Gimpel, he's summarizing stuff that in previous blog posts he had established, but I'll just summarize it quickly here. He says, the Middle Ages were anything but dark. Politically, there was decentralization and multiple sources for appeal. Law was defined by custom, individualized, one could say by contract, but not quite, more by sacred oath. The king's role was to uphold the law, not to declare the law. And so he says, in such an environment, if you're a libertarian, right, and you believe in decentralization and property rights and the role of law that is not, that you can trust, that you can plan because you understand the law is stable, and in that environment, he says, what would you expect? Creative and productive life to flourish. And he said, indeed it did. There were advances in artistic and literary life. Slavery was reduced when compared to Roman times before, and unfortunately later, as we discussed last time. Women achieved rights and status not seen again until very recent history. There was a high level of religious tolerance for new ideas. That's what you would expect in a decentralized society where law and property was held in respect. And that is what we find during the Middle Ages. So what I'm trying to blow apart, of course, is this picture that certainly was in my head, which is that the Roman Empire, the Greeks, the Romans, they were high culture, they were amazing, they were built these beautiful things that are still standing and all this. And then everybody was just in like the dirt, except they built some pretty churches somehow, I guess by exploiting the masses or something. I don't know how they did that, or how they even knew how to build those great architectural wonders. But basically everybody else was just, mucking around in the dirt, serfs, basically slaves on these huge manorial estates, and that's all that was going on. And then there's the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. They rediscovered classical learning. They threw off the shackles of religion that had been holding them back, and boom, suddenly they were conquering the world, traveling the world in 1492, discovering America and all that, right? Just, wow, it happened so fast, right? Well, it's a crazy story if you know anything about technological progress, scientific progress. All these things are incremental. They build up over time. You don't just go from being in the muck to conquering the world in 100 years. It takes time for these things to slowly develop and to slowly adopt more innovation and see, oh wait, this innovation can work with this innovation, to develop capital, right? A capital stock, so that you can invest in some new ambitious venture. If everybody's living hand to mouth, you're not going to go off and conquer the world, right? So the story we've been told, it really doesn't make sense if you think it through. That everything was just so terrible and dark, and then boom, just outsprung the secular salvation or whatever. It can't be right, and it isn't right. We could do other shows, just because the nature of this show probably won't. We could do other shows and really hone in on the artistic innovations, the architectural innovations of the Middle Ages. I tried to summarize very briefly the how slavery was being more and more outlawed in the early Middle Ages. There's so much to say. What Bionic Mosquito says here about the decentralization of law in the Middle Ages is a fascinating subject, especially from an anarcho-capitalist point of view. There's so much to be said about the Middle Ages, but I figured, hey, here's the place where the rubber meets the road, and it really fits the theme of our show, economic development. And so what I tried to demonstrate today is the Middle Ages had it. It had economic development. It had what Jean Gimpel says should be called an industrial revolution. So that's our main topic.
And it should be also noted that this was the age of the city-state. This was the age when city-states were really big players. I mean, Venice, Genoa. There are a couple other Italian ones, but those are the big two.
There's so many. Yeah.
Many in northern Italy and southern France and northern Germany. This was the age of lots of states competing against each other, and through this competition, competition, not just military but industrial and economic and freedom-wise, they had to compete, especially after the Black Death. They had to compete for these peoples, because people could just move to the next city-state. People just go away,
exactly.
And you had to offer them something that they wanted. And and this is with feudalism. Let's not get this wrong. Feudalism obviously was happening during the Middle Ages. This is with feudalism that this innovation and social mobility was happening. People need to understand that this hierarchical structure wasn't. People think that you're born a peasant, you'll die a peasant, and sometimes that's true, but not always. You can become a merchant and you can get very wealthy. You can improve your life. It's not like other systems like in the Middle East or in Asia where you're born a peasant, you die a peasant.
Right, and let's emphasize that. Two things. Number one, we're not covering, just for sake of time, we're not covering the decline of the Middle Ages near the end, which, to be fair to them, is part of the reason why the whole Middle Ages got a certain picture, because it wasn't, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of years here, right? It wasn't the same the whole time. And there were changes near the end that were not very good, and there was the Black Death and so forth,
There was the guilds, which was basically cartelish.
Yeah, there was
cartel unionized behavior that was absolutely destructive to innovation.
Right, exactly. So some people had bad economic ideas. Imagine that, and that caused some damage to the what had been a pretty flourishing economy. And as Gimpel mentions, social mobility started to become less common. So the late Middle Ages, as people are sort of looking back to the Middle Ages and they're closest to the late Middle Ages, they're seeing a much more static picture socially than had been happening for the hundreds of years before that. It had become calcified near the end in certain ways, but it hadn't been that way throughout. Okay.
It's the late Middle Ages that many people think about, because that's the full-plated armor knight. That's where the most lavish kings are. That's where all the innovation development had already happened, and it's already there for you to look at. But people don't look at the earlier innovation when it was actually happening. That's the more interesting part, and the conditions that brought that about, and the people that brought that about.
Okay, well, let's stop there. We have one super chat, which is Chris Primer, says, I will take your silver for the people. I don't totally understand that, Madmer, because he's actually giving us money.
Sorry, say that again?
His super chat, Chris Primer's super chat was for $5 US. I will take your silver for the people.
You have to win that silver. But
he's giving us money.
You have to win that silver, sir. And the way you can win that is by going to the Discord and entering into the currency design competition. You can design either notes or coins. We'll be reviewing them on a stream at the end of the year, just after Christmas. You have to the 23rd of December to get your entries in. Winner will get some silver on that stream. We'll be just having a bit of fun. Maybe we'll bring some guests on. We'll have a drink. We'll have a laugh. We'll just make it a nice, easy stream, celebrating our community, celebrating the growth over the last year, and thanking you guys for sticking with us, because don't know what we'd do without you.
Yeah. And I guess it was probably since our last show that we hit 2,000 subscribers. Is that right?
Yes, we have hit 2,000.
In fact, let's just do a little snapshot here. If YouTube hasn't decided to, do what it gets accused of doing. Nope. We're at 2.06, so we're past a little bit past 2,000 subscribers. So thanks everybody for subscribing. I hope this content continues to be interesting. And I guess we are all done for today. I had been letting it sort of get longer and longer, and my family gave me some feedback on that. So I'm going to try to get back to the original idea of kind of sticking to something like about an hour and a half or so. So thanks for, oh, wait, one more slipped in. Absolutely subversive with $5 Canadian. Are Canadian dollars good, Mad Merc? I don't know.
They're a solid currency for the moment, but let's see if that holds.
Right. Well, anyway, thank you. Absolutely subversive. He says, thank you, Mr. Liberation, Mr. Mercenary, for a great show. Have you ever been called Mr. Mercenary? I've never heard.
I have not been called Mr. Mercenary. I like it, though. I do like that.
Yeah. It has both, like, it sounds sort of like gentlemanly because the Mr., but threatening at the same time. I like that. That's a good combo. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.